Episode of the Pretend GM, I got to sit down with Bob Harris of Footballguys, and man, what a treat to talk to someone who has been doing this essentially as long as I have been alive. Bob was using newspapers and taking stats out to win in his fantasy football leagues. I learned so much from this conversation. I know you will too. Enjoy my conversation with Bob Harris, who just like you and me is a Pretend GM. It's so great that you're taking time to just to be here, just to chat. This is, you and I have done shows together, but I don't think we've done anything like this, where like we actually just we just talk, right? Like it's not players, it's not sleepers or anything like that. I was doing my Bob Harris research. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, in an effort to make sure that we're not just like, hey Bob, who are your sleepers? Who are you starting this week? You know, like what's your trade targets? Like I gotta go do my Bob Harris research. And so I go through. I go through and I look back and I'm just like, dude, you've been doing this since 1993. Is that correct?
That is correct. This is what, my 32nd year, 33rd year heading into. So yeah.
I mean, just incredible. So I look back, you've been doing this since 1993. You joined Fantasy Sports Publications, Inc. in 1997, correct?
Yeah, right about there.
Yeah, so you're doing like a bunch of their different stuff, like football diehards, and I mean I want to say this because it's necessary. It's like you have thrived across generations of fantasy players. Like it's not like Bob Harris fit into one mold, man. Like you did it for so many different people. I would say for fathers, sons, and next generations. It's just like, looking back at your career, what has made it work? Like, has there just been a habit or an approach, a philosophy? Like, what's the thing that made you just adapt and not just survive, but thrive when fantasy football in this industry itself is just always changing?
So it starts with just loving the hobby, loving the game of football first of all, right? Like started loving football when I was a kid, watching with my dad, played football from the time I was 10 years old into college. So, you know, that firsthand experience, and then the desire to stay connected to a game that you love. And here comes the thing called fantasy football that, you know, however tenuous and, you know, distant it is, it's a way to hold on to the game you love. And so I think that's kind of the starting point, but also, you know, from, you know, spanning the types of audiences or the time span, like there's a single thing that holds us all together. We love fantasy football, right? Like I can remember when I first got started, you know, playing in 1986, the first weekend I played, I said to myself, we don't have all the information we need to do this right. You know, that was the kernel of the idea, because, you know, you're getting these little tidbits and morsels of information at untimely points when you know, not necessarily needed them the most, like heading into game days, things like that. And so, you know, I got into business thinking, you know, if everyone loves playing fantasy football as much as I do, they want to be better at it. I'm going to be a billionaire in about a week when I start this business. Now, I'm still working on that part of that, but the other part is true. The audience, you know, I've always looked at it a pretty simple way. I'm preaching to acquire. I'm not telling anyone anything they're not already thinking, or they haven't thought about, or they're not trying to get a handle on, just like I'm trying to get
reinforcing those thoughts and vindicating the way they feel.
Exactly. And that's like a lot of the, you know, I think the interactions with the audience, you know, it's just struck me, you know, I don't want to say recently, but in later years is, you know, you're answering questions on the radio, on our radio show, and you're interacting with people. I mean, almost every question is some variation of, am I crazy too? You know, I mean, and so, you know, kind of when you take that approach to it, no, you got to be curious. You've got to adapt over time. I think those are important things. You know, separating the signal from the noise is always a big deal. And I think it takes a logical progression to do that. You have to be humble. You have to realize, like, the biggest thing, the hardest thing to overcome is being right or wrong are transient. You can be both right and wrong about the same thing in a span of an hour, right? And so over the course of a season, the things you were maybe right on heading into the season, or the theories that you were right on, proved to be wrong for no other reason than circumstances and the fact that the football is played with an oblong spheroid that bounces really funny ways, right? So you've got to be willing to, you know, acknowledge when you're wrong, and then learn from being wrong and evolve and use that to get better and hone your game over time. So I think those are the kind of things that string together, but mostly it's just the love of both football and and fantasy football. I mean, it's hard for, I can't imagine a world where I don't play fantasy football.
It's funny the way you said there, how they're kind of transient. There's this is not that deep of a cut for people. If they're listening to this, they like football. The movie Friday Night Lights, I always love the way that Billy Bob Thornton's character, Coach Gaines, he says, I've come to learn there's not much difference between winning and losing, just the way the outside world treats you. And it's really like even in this silly game about a game, like there's not much difference between winning and losing. It could be 1 point. It could be that one decision. You may have had the right process and an injury happens, like anything can happen. But like something you said there, it's how you recover from that. It's like not treating yourself poorly because you made a mistake, or not being like, well, I'm not good at this, or taking the wrong lesson from that. Right. So if you mentioned a bunch of different things there, but if you had the one lesson, right, like that one, let's call it rule of thumb for that audience member that is watching or listening this, how can they apply those lessons? Like what's the one thing that they could put towards, let's say, their weekly decisions or their drafts for next season?
Understanding what you control. Here's what you don't control. You're not out there. You're not blocking for anybody. You're not making tackles. You're not wrapping ankles. You're not calling plays. You're not throwing passes. You have a peripheral role in this, and it's observing and understanding what's going on the field and trying to assess that. So you got to be flexible. Don't be stubborn, stuck in your ways. Be open to new information that's going to be coming in at all times. Like everyone likes to joke. This is chess, not checkers. Okay, it's chess and not checkers. But man, when that triple jump is there for you, take it and crown that king, man. Make obvious moves, that make sense to you, and realize the outcomes aren't always great. Also realize that dynasty is maybe a little bit different, but in general, there's only one champion every year. You might or might not be it. Just big swings will get you there, right? So take chances and understand that the outcomes, are what you're looking for is a championship. And so again, the flexibility, don't be stuck in, like you go in with the mindset. It's part of that being right and wrong in the same season about thing. Knowing when you're caught, knowing when you're, knowing when you're wrong, saying, oh, dang, I've got to make this adjustment. And those are hard, those are hard things to get your head around in the midst of a season. When to make those calls and things like that are very difficult. That to me is the key is understanding your role in the game and accepting it. Like, okay, I'm the observer here. I've got to understand what the possibilities are and how I can leverage that range of outcomes that come from those possibilities to get me a win each week.
Do you think that's the biggest or most common mistake that fantasy players just make year after year? They sort of just stay stubborn?
I think some, yeah. Well, I think like I'm speaking for myself. Yes. Right? There's so many layers to it, like knowing your league and understanding your league and realizing that you're playing with a bunch of other sharp people who are going to make decisions that make it harder for you to make good decisions or limit your ability to be flexible and things like that. But yeah, in general, it is kind of just like, okay, I want to be aggressive and assertive, but I also need to realize that in being aggressive and assertive, I'm going to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. Things are going to change. Circumstances are going to change. The players that I love, that I've told, and I talk about this a lot. We tell ourselves happy stories about players to draft them and horrible stories about players that we want to avoid. And Lord knows I've told myself happy stories about guys like Anthony Richardson in the last couple of years. And there just comes a point where you realize like all the happy storytelling I've done is not going to come to pass. And you have
this is going to drop mid-season. There might be a happy story going on right now for Anthony Richardson. Let us know in the comments down below.
And I'm drafting it.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I mean, I feel like everything changes so much year to year. We have to remain flexible, even within the season, week to week. Like that's, I think, the thing that we forget the most is we get so caught up in how fun the draft is and what the rankings are. And then it all just sort of goes out the window after week one. And it's like even more out the window week 3. By the time you're at like mid-season, none of that matters anymore. The value you had on a player going into the season does not matter at this point. And it's like, if so much changes in that time, I'm curious, what has changed for you the most over your time playing fantasy football? We rewind back all the way to Bob Harris's first fantasy football league. And I think there's going to be obvious things there. Like there wasn't all the same like tech, but I mean, just from a philosophical standpoint, what changed the most for you and how you look at the game then versus now?
going from running blindly into the situation and drafting names to having a strategy and an approach. I mean, that's the biggest shift over time, right? In 1986, there was a bunch of guys and you wanted a bunch of those guys because you loved those players and you thought they were going to have good seasons or whatever. There wasn't a strategy to it. You saw a lot of Dan Marino going with the first pick overall, right? Like, like things that you wouldn't do, nobody's drafting the
There's still plenty of that. Like there's still like, hey, I'm going to take Patrick Mahomes round 1. Like that stuff still happens nowadays.
Right. And those people are probably getting beat. So, but I think that's the big change is going from, just going in and blindly playing the game to having an approach. I think everyone goes into a season now and you have your strategy. And like I tell everybody, I get tons of questions like, oh, what do you prefer to start at? This, that, or the other. And, being flexible and having a range of strategies available to you depending on how the draft plays out is obviously the right answer. But I think that has been the shift. It's now a more strategy driven game than more like an emotional or like, hey, I'm still playing on vibes. But back then it was all vibes.
Yeah, well, I do think that vibes still tend to be important, right? Like,
yeah.
For example, maybe this is totally different. I'm curious to see how it's going to be mid-season. But right now, preseason, I'd say vibes around Miami Dolphins have not been great. Vibes around Chicago Bears have not been great, despite all the new players and the new coach and everything. And I'll be curious to see how that plays out. Like there's a lot of positive and negative vibes, and there's some realism to it. But I think that we don't see it as much in the preseason. I think we actually see it more in season. And that's when it's like, once you've had like 3 weeks of a player just being bad, the vibes are gone. Like we can look back to like a Zamir White where everyone's like, oh, he's going to get the workload. And then you get, but it's like week 5 and you're just like, oh, he's not, sorry, man. Right. But it's like, you get there and you're just like, oh, the vibes continue to deteriorate. So
right.
What's the biggest difference between a good fantasy manager and a great one in season where it's like, I need to recognize that this player is not that good anymore. How do I make these adjustments?
Yeah, that fine line between, playing your studs and realizing going into a season, your studs are in your head, right? I mean, there's guys go in and like, players go in and you have an anticipated role and an outcome in your mind. And, how do you escape that? And I talk a lot about, just in general, divorcing your emotions from every process. Like, other than, picking your spouse or whatever, what great thing has happened when you've made a decision in the heat of an emotion? Almost never do I make a good decision in the heat of emotion. So the better I can divorce my emotions from the decision-making process, the better I am. And that can be very difficult. I'm not expert at it by any means. I still do stupid, irrational things on a regular basis in the moment that I realize immediately after, oh, what? But that's, to me, a big key is like just taking, stepping back from the emotional investment, the draft investment, and part of that is emotional. You told yourself that happy story all off season long to convince you this guy's like, man, I get this guy in the second round. Well, he's not that guy. And the sooner you can accept that, like, and that's not to say you have to give up on a player, but you have to have the flexibility to realize what you expected to happen isn't happening yet. And we can look back to last year, maybe Mark Andrews, who people drafted to be a certain thing that he was not for the first month of the season. There were people giving up on Mark Andrews. I might have been one of them, but giving up and bailing are two different things, right? You have to make adjustments. I need to win games now. Like, do I still think Mark Andrews is going to be good down the road? Yes. But in the interim, I need to win some games and I need to make some adjustments and be willing to do that. And then those are the kind of decisions that are probably the most difficult to make in fantasy football. And I think we all get caught up in that. Start your studs. Well, okay, you can start your studs, but if they're not actually your studs, you might want to stop, drop,
stud
give it a thought
is relative.
For a minute and reevaluate. That doesn't mean the guys you drafted be your studs aren't going to be your studs eventually, but when they aren't now, you have to be ready to pivot and understand when a good time to do that is.
You mentioned Mark Andrews in last season, and like that was a guy where he got cut by a lot of people.
He did.
And the same thing happened, like we can go back to Justin Jefferson's rookie year where he wasn't producing well early. He got cut and then all of a sudden, boom, like he just comes up out of nowhere. Not really out of nowhere, but I think there's always that fine line, that one decision, that sliding door for fantasy managers where they say, well, I really need this immediate depth piece or this guy that can start for my lineup who's going to get me 8 points. So let me cut this player who has this upside for later in the season. How do you prioritize that? Like how can you best manage that? Because we run into that a lot. You mentioned the starting your studs versus playing matchups. Like we do that all the time where sometimes we'll add a player who's not as good, but they have a good matchup and we start to like cut players with upside. There's just so much to it. So how do you navigate that?
Right. I guess, a good manager reacts a good manager reacts, a great manager anticipates, right? You try and anticipate what's coming and get ahead of it. And, I like people that do what we do. We're very busy during the season. It pays off for me to be thinking ahead a little bit and to anticipate moves, but also to anticipate situations and circumstances for players. When you see things taking a direction, right? Being willing to say, okay, I see that, and I'm going to acknowledge that by making an adjustment, whatever that adjustment is, right? But it's that willingness to adapt quickly. And it's just like in life. I mean, when you're, like, hey, is that a fire in the kitchen? Or there's a fire in the kitchen, I better go do something, right? There's two different approaches. And so however you navigate that is going to probably,
either way, I hope you have insurance
outcome, right? And make a better or worse outcome. And so it's similar in fantasy football, how you see something, perceive it, and accept that it's happening, and then act on it, not unreasonably, not overreact, but react. And I guess that's probably something that we should focus on too. Reaction and overreaction are two very different things. And one is very good and one is not.
So I think one of the biggest ways that we tend to react week to week in season is the hot waiver wire ad, the player that had that one big week, and someone will go out of their way and drop all of their fab or use their priority waiver wire spot, in line to go and add this player. And then all of a sudden next week, it's not the same story. 2 weeks down the line, it's a player that they're cutting all over again. And it's just this vicious cycle. So how do you balance that? Chasing the hot waiver wire ad. I know you had a really great line in there about a good manager reacts, a great manager anticipates. So is that something that you take into the waivers where you're not just looking at the role that player has then, but where it could be going in a few weeks from that on?
To me, I probably waivers are not what I consider a strength of mine. Because I'm trying to play a week ahead. Right. Busy schedule. I'm not always on the, available on the clock, whether I have a show or an assignment, whatever. And other people might get the jump on me. So I want to play a week ahead. But I do think there's something to be said for, like being proactive, grabbing players. Like if a player emerges, there's something to be said. Mike Dempsey, my radio co-host, is like huge on this. He will be quick to grab players, spend a ton of fab on them at the drop of a hat. It works out sometimes it doesn't. But when it does, it's usually spectacularly. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, like swing big. Only one person's champion. Nobody remembers second place. So that approach is totally understandable. I get it. It's generally not my approach. I try to be a little bit more logical and I guess I'm maybe just generally a little more skeptical when I see a single good performance. I take it as a single good performance and not necessarily a harbinger of things to come. But if there's been a drum beat or some context that adds to it, then I will be quicker to jump on it. And I think there's even something to be said for just keeping somebody away from your opposition. At some point, like, team, maybe you don't have a weakness to that spot, but other teams do, and you're going to have to play them. If not immediately, then sometime down the road when it matters more. So I do think the wiser choice is being proactive. I try to be a little bit overly proactive and try and, play ahead a week or so ahead. But in the moment, I think being aggressive is probably the right approach.
Have you done that before where you've you don't need a player, but he's the hot waiver wire ad and you kept him away from someone else in your league?
Yeah, especially in leagues where people are actively trading. That's not every league, depends on who you're playing with. But if you're in a league where people are going to actively trade and there's going to be people desirous of the pieces you picked up, absolutely. It's a good approach.
Do you find yourself doing something with your fab budget? Like I know there's a lot of people that say, hold on to it for as long as you can. I'm a little bit more of the mindset that I do think we get the most value out of waiver wire ads early in the season, because those are usually people that have been thrust into larger roles or they have made their breakout early in the season, which is something we just didn't realize in camp. We're talking about the Puka Nakuas of the world, Jordan Mason from a season ago taking over for Christian McCaffrey. These things do happen, and it's usually sometime within those first 3 weeks. So I tend to lean there of like, let me take my shots there and obviously pay attention to the context. But I know there are people that lean the other direction. They're like, hold on to that fab. You got to save it for the playoffs when you need it. Where do you land on that spectrum?
there's probably a middle ground that I'm probably on. You don't need to win every bid. You just have to win the right ones. And so I do want to have like a hammer at some point. I'm like that in auction drafts, and I'm like that in free agency. I mentioned Mike Dempsey. He will spend everything but $1 in the first week if he thinks the right guy is there. And I've seen him succeed with it. For me, it doesn't always lead to success. So I'm a little more judicious with my use and my spending. I'm not afraid to spend up for a good player early on, but I'm probably not going to be the highest bid, as a general rule of thumb, unless it's like a player I have a really strong feeling about. And that usually doesn't come from a single performance. That comes from a single performance plus a lot of context behind the scenes, probably dating back to OTAs and maybe even previous seasons.
Yeah, I think that's the important word that you use. There's context. Like that's what we need for everything, whether we're drafting a player, trading for a player, picking them up off waivers. Like you just need context. And I think that so often gets lost in the mix because people are just like, who do I pick up? Who do I start? Who do I draft? And like all that stuff does get lost and will react so much to the one good week. I know that one bit of context that you mentioned earlier, and I'm curious to see how you go about this, is looking ahead in schedules, especially when it comes to waivers or even just like maybe even setting up trades. So like what is that for you? Like how do you find it to be advantageous, to look ahead in the schedules, or do you prefer to take everything a little bit, week by week? How far ahead are you looking?
Probably a week or two ahead when it comes to waivers or matchups, like just, trying to stay a week ahead. And if buys coming up or injuries or concerns about possible injuries and you don't know the outcomes yet, then I'll probably look at, the schedule in the next 2 weeks. So, longer term, like, am I paying attention to buys? Yes, because I'm drafting a single defense. The onesie positions, I'm drafting a single player. As a general rule, big part of my strategy is the later the buy for those players, the better. But it's coming at some point. And so you start preparing for it. So I'll look at the schedule a little bit then. And then, I think we all, even before the season starts, we're looking at potential playoff matchups and what kind of stacks and players we can be putting together that might have advantageous situations. So I think that's kind of the range. It depends on what specific thing I'm doing in the moment. If it's waivers, a week or two. If it's, if I'm looking at the buys, it's going to be a little longer, and then playoff runs, but you got to get to the playoffs. So that's something I'm always mindful of as well. It's fun to think about them and to plot for them. And it's also better to get there.
Yeah. You mentioned something there, is that correlation of later games in the season. And I think that's something that gets talked about a lot during draft time, but I do feel like that maybe goes out the window with a lot of people when they're trying to make a trade or an ad in the middle of the season. They're just trying to live week by week. And I get it. Like fantasy football is it's played in pockets, right? It's played in those like 3-week pockets, but how much weight do you put into those correlated games when we get to the playoffs? Like if you see a Miami versus Cincinnati Bengals week 17, you're like, hey brother, I think I need to get some Bengals and Dolphins on this roster.
Yeah, I think part of that is how your season's going, right? Like if you're playing catch up and running from behind, you're probably not thinking about that as much. But if you're out there front running and you're, that's when I'm probably thinking about those things and saying, how can I set myself up for success down the road? If I'm scrambling to win now, I'm probably looking at a shorter window, a 1 or 2 week window of like, what can I leverage this week and next week that gives me a chance to put my hat in the ring, and I think that's probably going to be the answer on a lot of my strategies are going to depend on the team. And all know, I mean, like I talk about it every year, and I think we've all come to learn that, September is like basically the new August and October is the new September, right? If you're 4 weeks into the season and you're 0-4, it's a horrible feeling. But it's not over yet, right? Like weird things happen the first month of the season now because there's the practices have changed. The whole nature of training camp has changed. Exhibition football's changed. September is essentially exhibition football. Teams are trying to get it all dialed in and put together. So if you can take advantage and come out ahead during that period, great. But if you're not and you've fallen behind, you need to put some work in, but all is not lost. So, that's when I try to probably buckle down, narrow my focus, keep, not necessarily week to week, but closer to week, trying to just, battle my way back into relevance. And then I can start thinking longer term when I regain some relevance.
Well, I think like one thing that almost innately stops us from thinking week to week is when we're making a trade. Because when you are looking at a player, you're intrinsically going to look at what value do they bring me in the future. I I think a big mistake sometimes that people make is making a trade for a player that's got a good matchup that week and they're gonna help you win that week, but you're not looking at the future.
Right.
So how does, like, sorry to make you give us your secrets here, but like, how does that process even start for you where you say, okay, I need help at a certain position, or I just want to get more talent? How does that start for you when you're starting to think of a trade?
I think part of this, and this is something I also learned from Dempsey, who's a very active trader and has been for many years, is always be watching the rosters in your league. Look for players with teams with weaknesses. Find out, who has a shortfall, and especially teams that are struggling and may feel a little bit of pressure, a little anxiety to get back in the mix. And maybe you have a piece that can make them feel a little better about themselves. And I think the key to this is the best trades solve two problems. They solve my problem, they solve the other team's problems, right? And so, you look for those situations where everyone has a problem, and maybe we can get that problem solved, and people will be happy, even if maybe they aren't getting the best end of the deal. They're getting an end of the deal they can live with and that they think is making their team better. So it's always starting with scouring the rosters in your league, looking for weaknesses, looking for teams, checking the losing records at first, kind of go up in reverse order and finding the teams that are going to be the most desperate and have the most need, and then seeing what you can leverage, what they have that will help you, and trying to find something that you have that might make them feel a little better about their chances going forward.
So that's interesting because I do tend to do the same. I do tend to feel like the teams more likely to trade are the ones that are struggling, sure. But also sometimes you look at those teams and be like, they don't have anything I like. Mm-hmm. So that I think becomes the struggle, because I do the same thing where you start to look at who else in your league might be willing to trade, and that's obviously the first hurdle to get over. But then it's also, when does it become about you, where you're like, well, I really want X type of player. I need a wide receiver who has high reception upside, or I need a running back who has a really nice schedule later on in the season. Is there a point where you just say, man, you know what? I'm willing to pay up for this guy because I think it's going to help me so much more going forward?
Yeah, you're trying to approach trades as problem-solving exercises, right? Like, I have this problem. How can I solve this problem, right? It's like a math equation or whatever. And sometimes there does come a point in the season, by the way, where the teams at the top of the heap are going to be more interested in trades as they kind of shore things up, start looking for depth, or start looking for starting talent at a position of weakness that's going to take them into the playoffs, and maybe you can leverage that. But it's always about solving the problem. If I have a problem, I make a plan, then I try to make the plan better, right? And that's the same thing with trades. I'm sitting there looking and I'm like, this is hurting me every week. This is why I'm losing every week in this league. How do I fix this problem? And that's usually the starting point, and trying to find the solutions to the problem on other people's rosters then requires you to fix something on their roster, right? And so, and like, look, not every trade you want to happen. Maybe they don't view the problems I see them having as problems. Maybe they don't care if I have a problem, and they don't want to help me fix my problem. I mean, it's like everything, there are complex and nuanced issues there. But I think that's the starting point. If you try and look at it like, hey, I'm here to help you while I help myself. Everyone knows, everyone knows I'm not doing them a favor. Nobody expects a favor, but everyone wants to walk away from the deal feeling like they've come out with something they needed that's going to help them improve their team. I think if you look at it that way and you try to solve the problem that way, where everybody gets something they need, even if everyone doesn't come out with a winner, like, hey, I got something I needed. This isn't a great trade. This isn't a league-winning trade, but it's a trade that's going to put me on a path where I can be in position to win. I think you've got to just be realistic about it and approach it as a problem that must be solved.
So I love that approach, is, going after this as a problem that must be solved. But I think the tough part is, like, with us, we're not perfect, man. Like, we have our own problems. Sure. In like, I don't mean like in life. Like, that's a very different podcast if we're going to go down that road. I mean more so like in fantasy football, where we each have maybe sometimes our own blind spots, our own biases, our own things that we're not great at. So what would you say is probably I'm sorry to put you out there, what would you say is your weakest point in fantasy football, your problems per se that needs to be solved?
I guess I feel like it's been a long time, Alfredo, and I've spent a lot of time mitigating them. But I mean, you can't make problems go right. Like, I'm more aggressive than I should be in certain instances. Okay. Understanding the room I'm in can be a problem, right? Like, it shouldn't be, right? Like,
well, especially if you don't know the drafters, right, or the people that you're in your league with, that does happen sometimes.
Right. But I'm generally in rooms where I know everybody is probably the smartest guy in the room, and I'm not, right? Like
No, absolutely not true.
But I mean, I think that, getting your head around that, and I mean, we can go back to a couple of the Kings Classic, salary cap leagues that I first drafted in, where I was, made myself the laughing stock because I was just doing what I wanted to do without any regard. Like, oh wait, there's a bunch of other people in this league and they're really smart, and that's a sure recipe for disaster. And I've gone on and I've won the championship in that particular league. So I learned my lessons pretty quickly. But I think that's, that to me is like the starting point, is knowing who you're playing with, and knowing how you can avoid getting caught in traps of we all look at average draft position, right? ADP is not when you have to draft somebody, it's when somebody's getting drafted. And your job is to figure out how far above that you have to jump or how far below that you can wait to get the players you want the most. And so understanding the people you're drafting with and how they're going to handle that to me is still the trickiest part. And we play in super competitive leagues. I know many people do out there, and getting a handle on that, I think, is like job one in every draft. Like we did a Football Guys staff draft. And I mean, like, it's just a reminder of wow, I need to, it's better to jump up 2 rounds and get a guy going. And that's the other thing. Like, if there are players you believe in, knowing when you want to just jump up and plant that flag and make a stand on a player. I think all those kind of things are the kind of nuanced problems that I find for me are the most difficult to overcome. Like, I can sit here and start drafting in February every year. Right. And I will have hundreds of best ball teams and many, many redraft and many dynasty teams and guillotine teams, like a wide range of teams. And I think, like doing I liken it to lifting weights, right? You're working your draft muscles all year long. So when you get in the drafts that matter most, you don't get caught up short in a moment of panic or,
right.
And so I think that's super helpful. But also, you can kind of get in a rut and you get into where you start auto picking players at certain points in drafts, and you have to be careful of that. So I think those are kind of the weaknesses that I deal with of my own, and hope I can work around in fortuitous circumstances, and I get some lucky breaks to get me the players. That to me is like, you ingrained so many drafts over time. You start thinking you're going to get players at certain points, then you don't, and you forget the room you're in and kind of get lost in your own sauce there and end up with a lousy team or a bad thing. I'll say this though, when you're in a draft, like, I don't know if this happens a lot to you, but I'll be halfway through a draft, I go, man, this is the worst draft ever. This is just like every pick is not going my way. Everybody is getting all my guys. I see my entire team is on somebody else's roster or whatever. And then you get through the draft, you know what? I recovered pretty well. This didn't end up nearly as bad as I thought it was. So those are kind of some of my bad habits, or, looking down the drinking straw at the narrow portion of the draft, thinking I failed, and then, scrambling my way back and ending up feeling pretty good about it. But I think though, like in general, I think we all have kind of the same problems. We feel a little too sure about the players we're sure of, a little too uncertain about the players we're uncertain of. And we let that kind of impact how we draft, and we let the smart people in the room maybe can take advantage of that. And I hate when that happens.
Yeah, man. One of the things that I was just talking about on my show with Dave is like, I have never regretted taking the guy I just simply want to draft.
Yep.
Or like, even if I'm wrong, like, I never finish that draft and say, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. What I always regret is someone else drafting that player before me. Or if, like, we're talking in season, it's, if I had a good, I never say like, oh man, shouldn't have started that guy. And I mean, realistically, yes, I do, but I think I get more upset about the guys that I don't start when I go, man, I had a really good feeling about this player and I just didn't start them because I was too scared to do it.
Right.
Like, I think it's those negative hits that get you the worst. And you were talking about like the draft, how we have ADP. I think there's a similar thing that we have. It's almost our ADP on a weekly basis when we're starting players. And it's little projection numbers that we get in all of our fantasy apps that'll tell you this player is going to score this much and you're projected to win by this much. And I will say, like, almost every league I'm in, people use that as the gospel. Well, I'm projected to win by 10 points. I'll be fine. And then they'll lose by 30 and they're like, well, what happened? So I think when it comes to that, how do you balance, I mean, using what you're being given by these projections versus saying like, no, that opponent on the other side's got a lot of high upside players. I probably got to fight fire with fire and start more of my high upside guys. Like it's kind of plays off of the start your studs versus play your matchups thing.
I'd like to pretend that I'm really good at ignoring those projected numbers and I pay attention
Right.
only to my own numbers, but that would be a big fat lie. You look at those things, are staring you right in the eye. But that's the job, right? Is like going with your projection. And I think, one of the things you mentioned is, you regret not playing a player you wanted to. And I get questions all the time. And I talk about it constantly. I'm on the radio for 15 hours a week and I'm talking about my hunches. And I like to remind people, these are my hunches. You can play my hunch, but probably better playing your hunches because you're the one that's looking yourself in the mirror on Monday. But hunches are okay. Like we all get those feelings, and there is nothing worse than not playing your hunch. I mean, I get it. Sometimes it's not the most logical move or whatever, but again, at the end of the year, who's going to remember that you started X over Y if you came in second place? But if you won, you're going to be talking about, remember the week I played X over Y. And so like, I'm not talking about craziness. You're not benching Jamar Chase because it's a lousy matchup and he's playing in the snow or something ridiculous like that. But
only Mike Evans versus Marshawn Lattimore. That'll be allowed.
That might be it. That might be it. But those are the kind of decisions, the hunches, and it's harder to play your hunches when you're sitting there staring at those projections. I mean, I think they drive a lot of decisions that people otherwise would not make because it's sitting there in front of you. You're staring at it, and then you're going, oh man. And you'll sit there and how many times do you spend altering your lineup until that little dial leans your way? And then you look at the lineup and go, that's not what I wanted to do. I don't agree with this. And that's the key, is saying, I don't agree with this. And, having the courage of your convictions to say, I'm playing my guys. That's part of the fun of the game, and going with it. And, there's going to come a point where if it comes back and smacks you in the face too many times, you're going to start paying more attention to those projections on your app or whatever. But until then, don't be afraid to go with your own convictions about a player, a matchup, a circumstance. Those things matter.
So it's funny, man. Like I look at it this way. I'll make a quick comparison. The projection that you'll get from your apps to me is almost kind of like so for example, I use my GPS to go everywhere in my car. My mom loves to do the thing where she's like, yeah, you're going to take 3 rights. It's going to be behind the Burger King next to where the old Home Depot used to be over on Green Street. And I'm just like, I have no idea where that is, Mom. Can you just send me the address? I'll plug it into the GPS. And like, if I go somewhere where it's new and I don't have the GPS is not working because the signal, all of a sudden I'm lost. And I feel like so many of us do that same thing where if we don't have the projections telling us, hey, your team's going to win, you're like, well, I don't have my weekly GPS that I need that helps me. And I think it becomes interesting. Like, let's say we remove the projections out of there from your app or from anything. What would be the thing that is sort of just you following your streets? What's that thing that makes you set your lineup regardless of what those projections say in front of you?
Volume, right? Like, so I think and I know it's an oversimplification, but it's actually not. Volume, opportunities are the primordial sludge from which all fantasy points rise, right? That you don't get points without having a football in your hands. And I think like we get too cute sometimes with whether we're looking at matchups or week to week little, nuance or whatever. Who's going to have the football in their hands? The more guys I have who I know are going to have the football in their hands more times than other players, the better off I'm going to be. I don't care what the projections are. I want opportunities. And that to me is the thing that, I don't think people miss out on it. I think we innately understand that you're not going to have success unless you get opportunities, and like, that's going to be heavily influence everything I do all season long. From draft prep to drafting to setting lineups in season to trades to acquisitions to waiver wire pickups, everything I do is going to be based on anticipated workloads or possible increased workloads, but it's all going to be based on volume.
So you mentioned volume there, and that being sort of the thing that helps us simplify fantasy football, which it really should. Like I remember when I first started, it was a lot of, I like that player. He touches the ball a lot. That makes him good at fantasy football. And it's funny because almost as I've gotten more ingrained into the fantasy football industry and studying it, you find yourself latching onto a stat or a concept or like a philosophy. And then you're just like, why did I do that? That was so stupid. This answer was in front of me the whole time. Have you found that there's a thing that maybe either you or other people use, a concept, a data point that is just like misused, or like we rely on it just too much?
If the abbreviation for statistic has more than 3 letters, you should probably be careful. I do love, I think we all love that. I mean, that's part of what draws us to fantasy football, is that analytical aspect, and diving deep and looking at the yards per route run and the targets per route run, and all those things and they do matter.
We want them to tell a story, but like with anything, you can always manipulate that.
Right. For sure. Like there's always the great, player A, player B, and they're both the same player. I can tell you again, the happy story and the sad story about both those players if I'm doing my job well. But I think that's, I think we can overplay our hand on the analytics and get too deep, too lost in that sauce. And I think it's easy, for me, I try to pull back a little bit and say, okay, who's going to get opportunities? Look, there's a whole world out there where we understand when you're in a draft. There's a point in the draft where you're drafting ambiguous workloads. You don't know, right? But what am I gauging when I'm drafting ambiguous workload? Contingent upside. If this happens, if that happens, what's the workload going to be? Everything is going to be based in the end on what the possible, the range of outcomes is what we're always working with. And I credit the great Matt Harmon for, I didn't pay enough attention to that. He did an article for me a few years back that really drove home that range of outcomes. And you're trying to, what's the most likely? What's the least likely? And you do get to a point in drafts where you're flying a little bit blind. But in opportunities, in circumstances where I can find opportunities that I think are going to be reliable or I think are possible, that's the way I'm going to fly. Regardless of all the other numbers, I'm paying attention to all of them. I love digesting that content and reading about it and understanding it. But I think at the end, once you have your team and you're making those final decisions, who's going to have the ball in his hands?
Man, then that's a perfect segue. I was wondering how I was going to segue into this question, and you nailed it for me. Who's going to have the ball in his hands? Because I think we get this all the time in fantasy seasons where we hear, like, we're worried if player X is going to be healthy this week, and then we'll get the line from the coach that, well, we're going to go and see how he is before the game, test it out, and he'll probably be on a snap count. That can be incredibly frustrating as a fantasy manager. But how do you try to factor in that player's injury? Let's say it's like we've seen this before with like a guy like a Keenan Allen, who he had an injury all week. He was questionable all week, comes out right before the game, looks into the camera and says, you better start me in your fantasy lineups. And then he gets you one catch for 3 yards. And it was like a very real thing that people held on to. How do you factor in all that stuff when trying to make a decision when we have a player that's potentially, quote, on a snap count?
Well, I think, some of the history you look back on is, so there's one thing that matters most in the NFL is the head coach, right? He decides everything. He is the ultimate authority, and he has a history. And what's his goal? He's in a sport where he has to win 17 games a season. Every game is different. Every game plan is different. Where you're staying is different. How you practice is different. He wants to keep as many things the same as he can. How do I keep continuity? And so there are threads of things you can look for, like how he handles injury situations, how they handle various kinds of matchups. And I think I lean heavily on that, on the head coach for those kind of circumstances, and kind of trust how they've approached it in the past. Coach Speak Index has, great, information on that. You can find, things out there that help you understand that. But I think to me, that's the starting point. Like, I'm famously injury agnostic. I do not care if you've been hurt before. I am going to look to leverage that and gain value off it. If you were hurt last year, I am looking for you this year, no doubt, right? But I'm not stupid. I'm injury agnostic. I'm not injury ignorant. I realize there are some kinds of injuries, like chronically injured is different than a chronic injury, right? Like, this guy's been hurt a lot. Has it been weird things? Did he twist his ankle one year and then get a rib? I view those things differently than I view like a thing that's been bothering him every week for the last 10 years.
Yeah, if it's 3 ACL tears in a row, you're probably assuming this guy's just got an ACL
realize that's
problem.
Accordingly, but in the week, right. Right. But in the, once a player's on your roster, the week to week, you're going to have to, kind of discern that and sort it out. And I guess that's where, risk management and mitigating risk all come into play. Like, if there's a player on my roster, I think he has tremendous upside. but I'm worried. I'm not sure about the touches. Well, I'm looking at the rest of my roster, say, who's going to not get me zeros? Who's going to help me, have solid floors this week if I'm going to take a chance on the upside of this player with a question mark? And so I think, and that's the same with drafting too. I mean, as you're going through a draft, you're drafting like, okay, I took a guy that's a little risky. I better find something to mitigate that risk a little later in the draft or something to do that. Or I'm taking a high upside player. I maybe need a high floor player to balance that out. I think as long as you've built your roster with that risk mitigation and that balance worked out, you can kind of cover those issues and cover the weeks when there's a little bit more uncertainty than you'd like. And like, we're all doing the same thing. Like, we're not there. We're not in the locker room. We're not getting the decisions. We can like work on it. I'm doing the pregame show on Sundays. We're talking to beat reporters on the field, right up to kickoff, and you're trying to figure those things out. And I don't know. I don't want to say it's 50-50, but you don't know. I mean, it's going to go the way it goes once the game starts. And some of that is, hey, the guy takes the first step he takes and he's tweaks that ankle that was, well wrapped and leading up and looked great in warmups and all week in practice. So, again, mitigating those risks when they're coming, when you see a player's coming, like, he's a little bit nicked up. Maybe I need to play it a little safer at other positions.
It's funny you mentioned like how little we truly know about these players, and I did this show. I interviewed James Coe, who very specifically said we know roughly 10% about what is going on with these players.
Yeah, I think
there's so much.
Fair.
Yeah, there's just so much from the personal lives, the practice field, to the locker room that we just don't see. Like, we do worse in our jobs if we're having a bad day. Like, imagine these guys when they go on the biggest stage.
I think it's interesting. You hear someone, he's got a thigh bruise. Well, you think of a thigh bruise and you have a bruise on your thigh. They think of a thigh bruise that they're having 50 cc's of fluid sucked out of that thing every week. And then they're going home and they're treating it overnight. And I mean, it's round the clock treatment and things like that we don't really understand. When I watch games, one of the things I look for is anybody looking at something. Like if a player's running off the field looking at a finger, there's something the matter with that finger. Right? Like if the adrenaline and the moment of a game and everyone's a tough guy, if they're looking at some part of their body, I take immediate notice, say, that's probably not good, because they're different than we are, right? They're dealing with a whole different universe than we are. And so when there are issues, they're going to get huge treatment and stuff and you're prepared for it, but the outcomes can be wide and varied and this is just it. They're not going to tell us exactly what we want to know going into a game as a general rule of thumb. There are coaches out there that I think are more forthright than other coaches, or certainly more quick to acknowledge situations that are maybe a little worse than than maybe other teams would let on. But even at that, I think, again, the proper answer for us as fantasy investors is to mitigate our risk on a week-to-week basis in our lineup when and you're balancing the upside against the possibility that player gets you a zero. How's the rest of my roster going to react to that? Those are the tough decisions we get to make every week.
Man, and I think the thing that's always going to ring true with fantasy football is like the future is just unpredictable. The players are unpredictable, but while we are talking about the future here, how do you see this game changing and evolving over the next few years? Because it's already changed a lot over the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years. It's changed over the last, 30 years that you've been playing. Where do you see this game going to, and what should an audience member know about that?
I mean, I think you can expect more niche kind of scoring, boutique scoring, weird systems that, allow you to leverage different things. Like we've seen the rise of things like best ball and dynasty over the years, and, daily, had their moment. I see guillotine is popular right now. And I mean, I think it'll be more, a more varied way more varied ways to play the game. To attract more niche kind of players. I mean, everyone's going to continue playing in all the leagues they already play in. If you can find another thing that's a little different from those, let me play one of those too, right? Like if people are out there searching for an audience, it's not like a finite pool. There's a bunch of people playing, and even if they're playing in other things, if you can have something interesting and new that'll draw them over and ask to have them add to their portfolio, I think that's the kind of thing. So I think that's kind of a big part of it is the niches, and the personalization is coming. I think, I know there are some apps out there that are allowing you to make in-game substitutions now. I think you're going to see more and more of that. It's not for everybody. Like, does everybody want to sit around Sunday and make in-game substitutions? Probably not. But do some people? Yes. Some people absolutely are dying for that. And so more personalization where the data that's coming to you during the game, and the ability to make changes and adjustments based on that, I think that's going to be a big coming wave.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear it. My dogs absolutely love that answer that you are giving. They are going nuts for it in the background. But
My
you
cat's very
mentioned
excited by your dogs.
you mentioned like how much data is going to be available and how niche the game can get for us, and a personalization to it. And I think what happens is that, yeah, there's so many different analysts that are looking at this game, but I think we've already seen that there's been a little bit of a push of where else can I get information? And one of those things has become AI. And it's been a hot button issue, whether people like it or they don't. And I think I've seen all ranges of spectrum on this and opinion. Um, how do you see it being used? Like, when should or should it not be used? And do you see a good use for it by consumers in fantasy football?
The bus has left the station. Get on or get left behind. Right. So, I mean,
Okay.
I've looked at it as I don't want to be the candlestick maker turning on an incandescent bulb and wondering what the heck happened. Right. So I've kind of embraced it and I make use of it. Like I'd like to think I want to be responsible in using it. Right. Like I want to use it to improve workflows, not replace what I do. Like I use it to review my work, but none of my work goes in until it's done. Right. Like I'm not sitting
Okay.
there saying, tell me what I should write about this week or tell me what you think is a great idea. No, I go out and it's still untrustworthy in terms of research. I would never, it would be unwise to to say, hey, AI, tell me all these statistics, and then it will tell you a bunch of wrong statistics. I could have some anecdotal evidence of this. We just did, the magazine this off season, and we were using it for proofing, and one of those platforms just made up errors to make us happy that it found errors, right? That errors that
Oh
didn't
man.
exist. And so, and obviously that's not the worst case scenario because you go, oh, wait, that's not actually an error. It doesn't actually exist. I can easily get around it. But if you're trying to create content, you have to be really mindful of that. I think, using it to support your writing, to improve your writing. I use it to look for redundancies. I ask it, and I'm pretty, I use it pretty extensively to review my articles, but I ask it to take the gloves off, no guardrails. I want, tear this thing apart. And I want to make sure I'm writing and delivering content to a full range of the audience. And that's something I feel like is one of the reasons why I've been doing this so long, is I do understand that there are beginners and people who aren't as deeply involved and they want content too, and intermediate players and the super high end players who want all the information. I used to think of it as, there's people who sit on the toilet and think about tomorrow, and there's people who sit there and read the back of the shampoo bottle looking for every bit of information they can gain, and so I'm trying to write for that whole range of people. And so I do ask AI, am I meeting all the, am I delivering to all levels of the audience? And so I think using it for that, to me, it's, basically like, like using Grammarly or other writing tools is a little bit on steroids. But counting on it to do your work is probably unwise. But to process and simplify and expedite, mundane daily tasks, I think those things are all coming, and you should embrace it, because whether you like it or not, it's on the way. And the people, I think the old saying is, AI is not going to take your job. Somebody who uses AI is going to take your job. I don't actually know if that's true, but my gut feeling is that's probably for the time being more likely. As a customer, though, if you're out there, just, it can help you. AI will help you get informed faster, help you sort through the things. I mean, the thing that's changed the most from when I started doing this to what I'm doing now is went from like the scramble to find a tidbit of information, the work and the effort that went in, the time that it took to find one little thing, right? Now you turn on X or you look at anywhere, and I mean, you're sticking a fire hose down your mouth and turning it on. You're just getting hammered with stuff. So the job has gone from acquiring tidbits to sorting tidbits and trying to make sense of what matters and what doesn't, separating the wheat from the chaff. And I think using AI to collect up data, if you're a user out there, and kind of sort through it and help you understand the relevance of it, that matters. But I do think there's a place for the fantasy professionals who have been doing that a long time, like myself, yourself, to help people sort through that and point them in the directions they need to go. But again, it's coming. It's coming, and we should probably figure out ways that we can use it to our advantage. There are many people out there doing that already, and it's something that should be on our mind. Appreciate you,
Bob. This has been awesome, man. I've enjoyed having you so much. Of course, you guys can always check out all of Bob's work at Footballguys, where you can always check out my work and this show and everything. I'm so happy to be on the same team as you, man. And I know we're recording this before the season starts, but I'm excited that we're going to have another great season, another great year here at Footballguys. And for everyone that is watching or listening all the way through, we thank you so much for being here with us. I'll see you next time. Adios.